Welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. This is a great crowd. I know I know we're a little short on space, so if there is a lingering seat or two in the room, I do see a few, and hope that those of you standing in back will keep you entertained enough to make you forget that you're standing. It's great to see such a full room. My name is Mike Wakeford. I am Interim Executive Director of New Winston Museum, one of the sponsoring organizations for tonight's event. And I just want to start tonight by saying just a few things. We have a full program, and so I will keep them brief and then turn things over to our guests. At New Winston Museum, our mission is to connect, enrich, and enlarge the community through history, storytelling, and informed, balanced perspective that leads to acceptance, understanding, and belonging. And so we're thrilled to be here in a space that Bookmarks is sharing with us tonight, particularly important in our current state of affairs at New Winston, which is being a homeless museum, although that condition will change soon, and so I ask you to stay tuned for some exciting announcements coming in the near future. I do acknowledge I've said that. I've been saying that for about a year and a half, and some of you have heard me say it several times, but I know I mean it now, so stay tuned. Let's see. I just want to quickly, so you know who they are, I want to quickly acknowledge our guests up here with me, Dr. Elizabeth Herbin-Triant and David Ford, whose voice a lot of you hear every morning. I'll give fuller introductions in just a moment. Mostly, I want to thank several organizations for collaborating on making this event possible. The Wake Forest University History Department, Wake Forest University School of Law, Renolda, the Spatial Justice Studio, and Winston-Salem State. So thanks to all those organizations for helping us put this together. Want to very quickly tell you about two events coming up at New Winston. I take advantage of the microphone and do a pitch for our organization. One is coming up actually as soon as Saturday, I believe, and let me tell you about that. This is a gravestone cleaning workshop, a little shift from this. The gravestone cleaning workshop is co-sponsored with the Moravian Archives, and this is on Saturday from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Folks who are interested in this is all on our Facebook page as well. Should meet at the Moravian Archives at just before 4 p.m. and then you'll go out to the graveyard, and we have a guest coming. Is actually going to introduce folks to a contemporary technique for cleaning gravestones. And so, if you're interested in that, please know you should come in comfortable shoes and be prepared to do some kneeling. But otherwise, I think it'll be a really interesting event. And then, related to that, although not even intentionally, we're really excited about this. On May 11th, as part of Preservation Month, New Winston is co-sponsoring a historic cemetery trolley tour, and that is a collaboration with the Forsyth County Historic Resources Commission, Moravian Archives, the Winston-Salem African American Archive and Preservation, Forsyth. Tickets for that event are available online, and we do expect it to sell out. It will travel to several different cemeteries in the area, including let's see, let me make sure I'm looking at the right place. Mount Sinai Jewish Cemetery, the Waughtown Cemetery, St. Paul's Cemetery in Kernersville, and I'm missing one, Alana.
New Evergreen.
New Evergreen Cemetery. And is there one more?
No.
Okay. There's gonna be 28. There's 28 seats per trolley tour, I believe.
Yeah.
And we're making 2 runs, so it is limited. One trolley is going to make a run, unless you have a trolley. Do you have a trolley? You can bring your own trolley. Okay, we'll talk. we'll talk. So get your ticket soon. I can feel the energy building. So we're excited about that. So go visit our Facebook page or our website or the Preservation Month website, and you can find multiple routes to getting tickets for that. Want to just quickly say that Dr. Herbin-Triant will be available for some book signing if you're one of the lucky folks who has managed to purchase one of these books before it's even officially released into the world. We have early access to this book. There may still be a copy or two available in the store, and others of you have copies. So after the event, she'll be available to do that. I'm going to pass one thing around, which includes a sign-up sheet. If you want to get on New Winston's email list, please put your name and your email address on this. Tucked behind that, just in the name of efficiency, are some flyers for the trolley tour. So feel free to take one of those as well. Here, I have a pen, so you don't have to give up your pen. All right, I think I'm closing in on the end of the announcements. So let me just tell you about how we plan to structure tonight's event. We are in a moment going to hear from David Ford, who, as we started to talk with Dr. Herbin-Triant about this event, we also realized that WFDD, many of you know, has been doing a really interesting body of research and airing of stories related to inequity and segregation in the city, its historical roots, and perhaps more, just as important, its contemporary legacies. And some of that work is so resonant with the historical research in Dr. Herbin-Triant's book that we thought, wow, it would be great maybe to bring FDD into this. Dave has been one of the folks working at the center of that work at WFDD. So we're going to begin with David giving us sort of a quick primer and a few teasers of from work that has already been done and is going to be continuing in the coming weeks, months, and years. And then after a few minutes, we'll turn things over to Dr. Herbin-Triant, who's going to speak about her new and really important a piece of scholarship, this book, Threatening Property, Race, Class, and Campaigns to Legislate Jim Crow Neighborhoods. And though the title somewhat disguises this fact, Winston-Salem is at the dead center of this book. And so I think as of the official release date, this text is going to become part of the part of a short list of the really important pieces of scholarship about this city's past, and particularly the city's racial past. So I'm going to introduce both of you now, and then I'll just let things. I can stay permanently out of your way. We're first going to hear from David Ford, who's an award-winning radio journalist with 88.5 WFDD, public radio for the Piedmont and High Country. As a general assignment reporter, David covers a wide range of topics from infrastructure to arts and culture. He's currently researching eviction rates in the Triad for a multi-part radio series scheduled for broadcast later this spring. And for those of you from around these parts, you know David is even more interesting than that makes it sound. So we're lucky to have him here tonight. Let me also just interject quickly. After we hear from both, we'll have time for Q&A and discussion. So rest assured, the plan is in place to I'm sure, entertain what I suspect will be a nice big set of questions and observations. Elizabeth Herbin-Triant is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, where she teaches courses in African American history and the history of the U.S. South. Her book, Threatening Property, Race, Class, and Campaigns to Legislate Jim Crow Neighborhoods, was just published by Columbia University Press in the series Studies in the History of U.S. Capitalism. Herbin-Triant is a graduate of Harvard and Columbia. Harvard undergrad, Columbia is where she earned her PhD. Her scholarly articles have been published in the Journal of Southern History and Agricultural History, and she has published op-eds in the Washington Post, including one just a few weeks ago. Herbin-Triant grew up in New York, but has roots in Greensboro, North Carolina. So it's my great pleasure to welcome first David and then Dr. Herbin-Triant. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. Thanks, Mike. Welcome, everybody. It's so great to see so many of you here and for such a really important conversation. I'm just thrilled to be here. Thank you, New Winston Museum, and thank you, Bookmarks, for hosting this event here. He's off. And congratulations to Elizabeth Herbin-Triant for just a wonderful book. I picked my copy up yesterday when I was here for the sound check, and I can say that although I have not finished the book yet, just the introduction itself has been a page turner, and I'm looking forward to finishing it. It's really it's fun. So Winston-Salem has changed quite a bit since I moved here in 2002, around 2002. Lively nightlife, microbrews, new restaurants downtown, the new bike trails expanding. But Winston-Salem also has one of the highest eviction rates in the entire country. 1 in 4 children don't know where their next meal is coming from. And in terms of income equality for those children, Forsyth County is ranked 3rd from the bottom out of 2,478 counties in the U.S. So how can that be, this tale of two cities? Well, in just about 5 minutes, as Mike said, Elizabeth will be sharing some of the historical reasons behind how we got here. But first, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the situation on the ground today. Since I'm a radio guy, this is going to be based on some of the radio stories that I've done at WFDD over the past year or two. So, redlining was a real estate practice that began in the 30s, where lenders discriminated mostly against African Americans by refusing to loan them money or extend them credit in certain areas of town deemed hazardous. This is a redlining map, for those of you who've never seen one before. And I'm going to raise my voice here to point things out. This is best property, desirable property, 1937, Buena Vista area, Buena Vista neighborhood. This over here in the red is deemed hazardous, undesirable. That's Boston Thurman neighborhood. This is Thurman. Our son goes to Paisley Middle School, just up the road there. Cook Elementary, Whitaker Elementary. And for those of you, and right in the middle, this vast emptiness space is the children's home. So, for those of you familiar with the city at all, you can see that these red lines have not moved much since this map was made in August of 1937. Meanwhile, modern-day redlining is alive and well in Winston-Salem. Banks are still far less likely to give people of color a mortgage loan than their white peers, even if they're in good financial standing. Reveal is a public radio show that's done some really great reporting on this topic, and I recommend you check it out if you haven't. I really enjoyed their series. Here's what Reveal reporter Aaron Glantz had to say to WFDD last year about 2 of Winston-Salem's biggest banks.
The State Employees Credit Union made 1,000 loans and made about 100 of them to African Americans. So they were 10 to 1 lending to whites over African Americans. But Branch Banking and Trust, they made only 13 loans to African Americans in the Winston-Salem area.
And that was last year. Beginning in the 1950s, along came a couple of major roadways like Business 40 and Highway 52 that tore black neighborhoods apart. The African American communities downtown and in East Winston never recovered. And some continue to be dissected today with the Downtown Business 40 project. This is Sarah Hill Carter. She moved to Winston-Salem in 1964 and purchased her home with a $50 down she's great. She's in her late 70s and takes Zumba classes down at the Y. I'm sure many of you know her. Sarah's great. Her house was number 44 on this NCDOT map. That's the Peters Creek roundabout. I say was because the city demolished her home last fall to make way for the new Peters Creek Parkway roundabout. And I spoke with Sarah about it that summer.
The thing that bothers me, David, is I don't know where I'm going. I don't have no idea. I worked all my life, paid for my house. To me, it was the American dream to own property. And now my dream is gone.
And even those in East Winston who are able to keep their homes are finding their home values declining. Yolanda Harris still lives in East Winston, the same home she grew up in 50 years ago. Her parents were the first homeowners in her family's history, and they left their children this home for a leg up. But just as home prices in other parts of Winston-Salem began rising, following the Great Recession, East Winston real estate values plummeted, including the Hairston family home. It went from an appraised value of $128,000 to roughly $58,000, a 55% devaluation of her home. Hairston wonders if this is the first step in a long transformation of East Winston.
And that's really cruel when you also think about the fact that all of these lovely people live near downtown because we were run out of other areas. And, you know, this was our reservation, if you will. And now we've got to move off the reservation for the next group of people, and it starts all over again. So where do we go now?
Sorry to keep you hanging there. And in the triad, for those who aren't able to be homeowners, most people rent. And currently in the triad, there's a record-setting number of tenants being evicted, as mentioned earlier, the vast majority of them African American. Winston-Salem has the 16th highest eviction rate of all large cities in the United States. Greensboro is number 7. Over the last several months, as Mike mentioned, we've been investigating the reasons behind these numbers and their lasting impact on people's lives, the lasting stain of eviction. Like Keisha Wisely, who was evicted from the Cleveland apartments. She and her 10-year-old daughter have been living out of a suitcase since then.
I've spent over $250 on application fees for houses and apartments to either have it fall through because this eviction is on my credit or the house is not up to code.
Thankfully for the city, there are lots of great local organizations doing fantastic work, looking for feasible ways to reverse these trends in Winston-Salem moving forward. And thankfully now, they have Elizabeth's clear, well-researched book on the historical roots of this city's racialized geography, and I can't wait to hear her talk about it. Thank you very much.
I'm going to donate my seat to one of these. Maybe I'll take it back for the Q&A. So. I wanted to start by thanking the New Winston Museum and particularly Mike Wakeford, who put a lot of effort into planning all this. I'm really grateful. Thank you to the Wake Forest History Department, the Wake Forest Law School, Reynalda House, the Spatial Justice Studio and Winston-Salem State, and also to David for being here. But thank you to all of you. I'm really overwhelmed seeing so many faces here, and it really is wonderful to go from working at a computer for years, just sort of in my own little bubble, to send my work out into the world and see so much interest. So it really means a lot to me. I'm really grateful. I'm just very glad that you all care so much about this history. So thank you. So I thought I'd just start by talking for a moment about Plessy versus Ferguson. So the 1896 Supreme Court case that said that segregated accommodations, public accommodations, were constitutional. And can you all hear me? Okay.
You can get the microphone up a little more, the button on the
That might be it. It's height discrimination, right? All right, so the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, I think everyone's familiar with the fact that public accommodations were segregated. And you see some images of the segregation of public accommodations here. So you see a segregated waiting room, right, in a bus terminal. You see a segregated water fountain. And the idea is that the accommodations are separate but equal, but that's rarely the case. And you see that with this water fountain, right, where the one on the left is refrigerated water, a newer machine. The one on the right, even though the water comes from the same source, is kind of a dingy water fountain. You see the Negro Motorist Green Book, which has received a lot of attention lately, particularly with the Oscar-winning film that just came out, which the reason for being for this book was to save African Americans the embarrassment of stopping at facilities like the one on the right, a gas station that has all kinds of signage making clear how unwelcome African Americans are at this place. So yeah, the public accommodations, we hear this history a lot, but one history we don't hear as much about is the segregation of residential properties required by law, right? So there was a moment in history when many southern cities passed these ordinances saying that neighborhoods had to be segregated. So the Supreme Court case of Buchanan v. Worley declared this unconstitutional in 1917. So it's, as I mentioned, short-lived. And it starts around 1910 in Baltimore and then just sort of moves from one southern city to the next. But I'm interested in why residential segregation is the line past which Jim Crow can't go, right? So why is it that public accommodations stay segregated, right, up through the 50s and 60s, but neighborhoods are not. I mean, obviously they're segregated, right? We just heard from David just how segregated they are, but we don't have laws saying that they must be segregated. So here are the research questions that I look at in my book, and I'll read them so that people over on the side who I know can't see the screen can hear. So first, who supported laws requiring segregated neighborhoods in North Carolina and why? Who opposed them and why? So I talk about class, and I argue that it's middle class whites who want residential segregation laws and elites who are not really on board with it. I'll talk about why in a moment. So how did visions for white supremacy vary by class? So we talk about many whites being on board for white supremacy during this period, but they don't all have the same aims. So middle class whites will want to sort of protect themselves from competition with African Americans over jobs, over housing, but elites, their vision of white supremacy is more that it'll make cheap labor available to them. And then the third question is, why did residential segregation ordinances become the line past which Jim Crow could not go? And here I'm thinking about South Africa, which was an inspiration for segregationists, who I'll also be talking about today, Clarence Poe. So Poe's inspired by the Natives Land Act in South Africa, which, I'm sure many of you know, it sets aside these reserves that Black Africans would live on, saying that they can't purchase property outside of those reserves. So this could have been the fate of the U.S., right? So why didn't residential segregation go that route? So yeah, I think it could just be much worse than it is. So maybe that's a hopeful comment, right? Right. So some historians have talked about a solid South. And I wanted to kind of poke some holes in that idea, right? There's this idea that among white Southerners in this age of Jim Crow, there's political unity. That there's, the Democratic Party, everyone belongs to the Democratic Party, they all see eye to eye politically. And so in focusing on class, I'm saying that that's not so. So elites, I think, do end up victorious in their vision of white supremacy and what it should achieve vis-a-vis this residential segregation ordinance situation that I'm talking about. But that doesn't mean that there weren't other ideas out there, right? So there are other visions for what white supremacy should achieve, and just because they didn't work out doesn't mean that that they weren't there, right? So I think the solid South is not, it's more of a myth than a reality. So I thought I'd start out actually by reading my argument, which is just the first page or two of my book, so you can kind of get a taste for the book, but also hear the argument, so it's not as off the cuff as as they're just saying it. So I will read a bit, but most of the talk I'll just be talking without using the book. 50 years after the Civil War began, African Americans were making measurable economic progress in North Carolina. Formerly enslaved people and their children scraped together meager earnings from hours spent under the sun tending cotton, tobacco, and other crops to purchase farmland, which they did at higher rates than white farmers. Bless you. Urban workers, that's not in the book. Urban workers labored in hot tobacco factories and used their savings to buy modest homes. They put money into churches and into schools, producing black teachers, lawyers, doctors, and business owners. Their rise took place slowly as they faced significant hurdles, but steadily. W.E.B. Du Bois, discussing the successes of African Americans in Durham, noted that unlike white entrepreneurs who are able to look to wealthy investors and expert advisors, quote, the Negro gathers capital by pennies from people unused to investing. He has no experts whom he may hire and small chance to train experts, and he must literally grope for success through repeated failure. In parts of the state, middling white people, above poor whites financially but perpetually in danger of losing economic and social status, met the successes of African Americans in gaining property with a vicious backlash. In both the countryside and in some cities, they worked to limit the areas where African Americans could purchase property, hoping to keep for themselves access to valuable farmland and urban real estate, along with the better standard of living available in neighborhoods that received municipal services. These people worked to sort property by race in the neighborhoods occupied by the middling classes. Elite neighborhoods were already sorted by race, as their only black residents were employees living with their employers. And in doing so, to create an unequal system in which African Americans had a harder time acquiring property, and in which the property they did acquire was less valuable simply because it was in a black neighborhood. White elites rarely led this backlash, and in some cases they worked to contain it. Indeed, white Southerners were a varied group made up of people who did not experience the world they inhabited in the same way. From farmers who competed with African Americans over the purchasing of land, to planters who hired African Americans to work their soil, from laborers struggling to make do in urban mills, to factory owners whose fortunes were built on textiles and tobacco, white Southerners' economic and social situations played an important role in shaping their perspectives. White Southerners generally supported a set of policies that fit under the banner of white supremacy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, policies including the segregation of public spaces. But we must be careful not to overstate the extent of their agreement with one another. When it came to policies that affected their own economic opportunity, including access to property ownership, decent wages, and cheap workers, the things that separated white Southerners from one another led to bitter disagreement. White supremacy did not mean the same thing to different groups of white Southerners. A shared whiteness did not overcome the divisions between and among white people in the South. All right, so I thought I'd start by talking a bit about R.J. Reynolds, who is an example of an elite white who you know, when I said I'll talk about classes, right? Here we have the elite class, and the elite class started investing money into industry around 1885, and that's you know, that's sort of Reynolds' story, right? He's from Virginia. He's from the planter class. Takes some family money and invests it in a tobacco manufacturing facility. So you can see on the top the first factory that R.J. Reynolds owned. He had 12 employees, and he'd sleep on the floor to protect it from fire and also to save money. And then on the bottom, of course, you see the whole complex. So this becomes a huge success. And on the left, you see tobacco leaves getting ready to be processed into cigarettes or plug tobacco, and then of course an ad for the Camel, which is that's the big product where R.J. Reynolds hit the jackpot. And I just wanted to read some of the copy on the ad so you can get a sense of who's buying these cigarettes, so who R.J. Reynolds' target customer is. It says, to cigarette smokers of America who smoke 5-cent, 10-cent, 15-cent, 20-cent, or 25-cent cigarettes, here are Camels, 20 cigarettes for 10 cents, a choice blend of specially selected Turkish and domestic tobaccos. No man's money can buy a more delightful cigarette at any price. So in mentioning the cost, right, it's clear he's thinking of you know, poor or middle class consumers. And so when I talk about elites undermining residential segregation laws, you'll see they're not going to want to do it publicly, right? He wants to do it kind of behind the scenes because he does still want to keep these people as consumers. So we have elites, we have poor whites. The situation of poor whites became worse after the Civil War. So, you know, many of these people, you know, didn't even want to join the Confederacy, right? Didn't want to fight the Civil War because they, you know, they didn't own slaves, but, you know, they did get sucked in. You know, many then deserted, but their properties were devastated by the war, right? Their fields were devastated. That, you know, their livestock. After the war, they're expected to start paying taxes. So many of them get sucked into sharecropping. You see a white child right here in the sharecropper's cabin that you're looking at. And of course, many poor whites will leave sharecropping to take jobs in cities, in textile factories particularly. I have an image here taken by Lewis Hines, where you see child labor in a textile factory and get a sense of just how dangerous that is, right? Here you see children with their fingers and toes poking out. You know, their clothing can get sucked into the belts. You know, they lose even limbs. Some of the workers whose accounts I read talked about people whose hair would get caught in the belts and then they'd get scalped. So really awful injuries. So yeah, giving you just a sense of the poverty that families are experiencing, that they have to send their kids out to work in these factories. But it was whites who'd work in textile factories, and then African Americans would work in the tobacco factories. The thinking was that they believed that African Americans couldn't handle mechanized work, so they thought that labor would be better for whites. So we have elites, poor whites, and then the group that I focus on is middle class whites, middling whites. And these people would be factory managers, shop owners, etc. So think of a lot of these shops here. So we're looking north from 4th Street here around 1917. So this would be an area where you'd have a lot of middle class shop owners. So we have these three groups, and the story that I'm telling is about both the countryside and the city. So we have sort of a statewide effort to put residential segregation into law. It's not just in one place in the state. And one question is why North Carolina, right? Why is North Carolina the state that has so much activity around this area, right? So much activity trying to put residential segregation into law. And I think one answer, at least when thinking about the countryside, is that this is a state where there were a lot of small white farmers, right? That there was opportunity for, compared to other southern states, there was opportunity for small white farmers. And they had a voice. They had a voice particularly through the farm journal, The Progressive Farmer. So they're able to sort of push for their interests, at least as they perceive them. So the man on the left here, and also right there, in older age, is Clarence Poe, the editor of The Progressive Farmer. He was born in 1881 and grew up in Chatham County to a family that it had owned some slaves, but was not necessarily elite, as he told the story. And as a young man, he went to Raleigh to start working on The Progressive Farmer, which was the organ of the Populist Party. It was kind of a smaller publication, and under his editorship, it became a huge success, becoming a widely sold journal that any farmer in the South would want to read. So not just in North Carolina, but throughout. And he sought to have his ideas adopted, not just in North Carolina. So he's kind of the figure who's agitating for residential segregation laws in the countryside, and his goal was that it would start with North Carolina, but then it would spread to the other southern states. And I want to mention he was married to the daughter of Governor Charles Aycock, who you see on the right here. And both Poe and Aycock are perceived as progressives, right, as reformers, as improving things. And Poe's effort to bring about residential segregation, he perceived that as a progressive reform, right? He didn't see it as something that was meant to harm African Americans, although of course it did. He saw it as improving the situation, particularly of middle-class whites, which was the group that he was concerned with. So he says that segregation is the key reform that will enable small white farmers to build what he calls a great rural civilization in the South. As I mentioned earlier, he's inspired by the story of South Africa. He met a white South African named Maurice Evans on his honeymoon, and was very excited to hear about what was going on in South Africa with the Natives Land Act. He did a few things to push for residential segregation law, but maybe the main one is that he campaigned for an amendment to the North Carolina state constitution that would set up a process whereby communities can vote if they want segregation. And this did not succeed. So at first I'm trying to figure out why study a failed amendment, right? But I think, as I mentioned earlier, even things that fail can be important in revealing, the goals of various groups, like the interests and the goals. So Poe was really concerned about Black success. So the introduction that I read to you, it starts with this story of Blacks gaining property, right? And the efforts that are being made by Poe and others are about backlash, right? So here are some statistics on African Americans gaining property in the state, moving from having about $658,000 worth of property in 1870 to over $22 million worth of property in 1910. And this was one of the sources that I used where I could see Poe's family on the census. They have a farm that's surrounded by African American farmers, and this was something that provoked great anxiety in the Poe family. Will their property values decline, etc. So I think it's that anxiety that's behind this effort to put residential segregation into law. So some African American leaders respond to Poe's plan. Booker T. Washington talks about it, and Booker T. Washington, you may know, didn't criticize much in the way of segregation, but he did criticize Poe's plan, and maybe I won't read the whole quote just because I want to have time to get to Winston-Salem, but he's saying that this will stir up racial hatred. W.E.B. Du Bois also criticized it, and I'll just read the last line that's here. He says, sorry, this is small font here. Anyway, yeah, sorry, I won't read it just to save some time. Yeah, no, it's too much text. I'm gonna save it. But or you know what? I think the part I was going to read. Oops, it might be cut off at the bottom. But he makes the point. Yeah, unfortunately, it is cut off. But he makes the point that this is an agitator, not like Tillman. He lists some other white supremacists who are sort of vocally talking about lynching, right? Saying, let's lynch the N-words, right? He's saying it's not this type who's leading residential segregation campaigns, but it's someone who in many ways represents the best traditions of the South, like Clarence Poe. He's a progressive. So it's even more concerning, according to Du Bois, that someone who's perceived as moderate is pushing for this. So turning to Winston-Salem and to cities generally, because it's not just Winston-Salem, it's Greensboro also passed an ordinance, Mooresville. Charlotte was talking about passing an ordinance, but didn't do it in time. There was a case that went up to the state Supreme Court that declared it invalid, and so Charlotte was sort of waiting on that case to decide with Plessy whether they'd have their own ordinance. But so turning to Winston-Salem, you see again middling whites pushing for residential segregation laws, and the articles that are being published in the Winston-Salem Journal are focusing on this fear of damage to the property of whites, and what that damage really was is something that an African American described, I have him quoted in my book, he described it as a suicidal action, right? So the property values go down when blacks move into a neighborhood, and that happens because whites will flee, right? They'll sell their property at any price to move out, and thus the values will decline. So another article mentions that here you have African Americans who are moving in who are willing to pay much more for real estate than the average white man can, showing us that it's not poor blacks moving in, but blacks who've saved up some money working in tobacco factories. They have a modest prosperity. They've had some success. They're moving in hoping to access better municipal services, etc. And then they're in the neighborhoods of average economically whites who again feel this anxiety that their property values will decline, and they feel that they can't afford to have their property values decline, right? They're concerned about status and very much do not want their status to decline. This is one of the sources that I used, and yeah, unfortunately the screen's a little small, but it's the Sanborn fire insurance maps. This one is from 1900, this one's from 1912. And you can see this block between Linden and Sycamore is empty in 1900. In 1912, there are homes here which are occupied by African American tobacco workers. And so just east of Linden are homes occupied by whites who again feel this anxiety. And so they push for a residential segregation ordinance, which is passed in 1912. And then of course, so going, you see here is Vine, and then you have Negro tenements, they're described as on here, and then the Reynolds Tobacco Company. So why are blacks moving into this neighborhood? They want better access to the factories that they work in. And again, just to give you a sense of the sources they use, again, the census, you can see the tobacco workers who, I pointed out on the last map, you can see them listed, you can see their race, their age, where they work, in the tobacco factory, what their jobs were, their rollers in the tobacco factory. And here's an image of what some of the housing of tobacco workers looked like. This is also the image on the cover of my book. And this is an area that it's swampy. The creek will overflow. There are mosquitoes. It's not ideal, and I think it makes sense why a lot of African Americans want to move out of this neighborhood when they've saved up enough to move into a more desirable neighborhood. So I look at what African Americans did to respond to the ordinance, and it's really not much to respond to it. So the leader in the city, the African American leader in the city, is Simon G. Atkins, who you see right here. Here's his wife, and I think one of the classes at Slater Academy, now Winston-Salem State University. And I think there are a few reasons why Atkins didn't oppose the segregation ordinance more vocally. For one, he relied on the largesse of local whites. The African Americans who attended Slater could not, the money that they could pay wasn't enough to keep the school afloat, so he needed money coming from local whites. Also, it may be that another reason he didn't say anything in opposition to the ordinance is that he'd founded Columbian Heights, which was a neighborhood occupied by middle-class blacks, which perhaps stood to gain if African Americans can't move into the white neighborhoods. Then the option for upwardly mobile blacks is really Columbian Heights, right? So his own neighborhood can benefit if African Americans can't buy elsewhere. How did elites respond to the ordinances? As I mentioned before, someone like R.J. Reynolds isn't going to want to vocally oppose it because he has consumers buying his products. He doesn't want to kind of become unpopular. Also, residential segregation didn't affect him personally, right? Blacks were not moving into his neighborhood, so he lived where the new Forsyth County Public Library is. This is before he moved out to Reynolds, but this was his home, and you see here his children in front of the home with a black groom holding one of his children. So to elites like Reynolds, a paternalist like Reynolds, he's not troubled by proximity to African Americans, right? As long as they're in a subservient position, as is the case with this groom, this isn't a problem to him. So the person on the left here is Gilbert. I've been pronouncing it Stephenson, maybe it's Stevenson. He's now, his papers are at Wake Forest. So he was the city's attorney. So when there was this case that I mentioned earlier, it goes up to the state Supreme Court when a man named William Darnell moves into a formerly white neighborhood, a tobacco worker, again, sort of fitting this profile, right? He saved up some money, he moves into the more desirable neighborhood. There's this backlash, right, because he is now sort of broken the ordinance, and so you have Stevenson serving as the city attorney. He has to make the case for why the ordinance is legal. And so, I mean, this is kind of a long and complicated story. If you want the full thing, you know, it's in the book. But Stevenson, I mean, he strikes me as someone who's kind of half-heartedly defending the ordinance, because he's also publishing books and articles that criticize Poe's segregation plan. So, you know, why would he be in favor of segregation law for the cities if he's against it in the city, but I'm sorry, in the countryside? But, you know, it seems like we have this story of a class of elites who are not behind the ordinance, and the Supreme Court's Chief Justice, Walter Clark, ruled against the ordinance in Winston-Salem, kind of making this case on behalf of elites that workers are needed in the city, right, and that an ordinance is going to have the effect of pushing good workers out. So he argues, the case decides that the ordinance was not unconstitutional, but rather adopted without authority of law. It then says that the state has an interest in, quote, retaining the colored laborers in the state. And he says that not only the city's residential segregation law, but also Poe's plan for the countryside, would have a negative effect. He says that Poe's plan would lead to, quote, a large exodus of the most enterprising and thrifty element of the colored race, leaving, and then sorry, for some reason the bottom part of the screen is cut off, but the full quote's in the book if you want it. But anyway, so here we see this focus on corporate rights, right? So the elites don't really care about middle-class whites and their economic interests and the case they're making for why they don't want blacks in their neighborhood. They're thinking about corporate rights, the needs of someone like R.J. Reynolds to have cheap labor. And so, they, for that reason, I think, residential segregation law doesn't come to much. And then, of course, the Supreme Court rules in 1917 that these ordinances are unconstitutional. And again, it's a kind of a long story here, but they're defending property rights, but not necessarily the property rights of African Americans. The man here, Buchanan, was a white man who wanted to be able to sell his property to African Americans because he could not find white buyers. This was a test case, by the way. And so the court is sort of sympathetic with a white man who wants to sell the property, but isn't sort of paying attention to African Americans who are looking to buy and sell property. But anyway, so we have this moment, right, when residential segregation law is declared illegal, yet residential segregation does continue apace, right? And so I just wanted to point to some ways that residential segregation continues even after sort of the death of these ordinances and after the death of Poe's constitutional amendment. So Winston-Salem passed this zoning ordinance in 1930, which was essentially the same thing as the 1912 ordinance that I mentioned. But it was also zoning for other things like residential use, et cetera, et cetera. But then the Supreme Court of the state said, no, this has already been decided in State v. Darnell, so they had to go back to the drawing board with this. So then we have Clarence Poe, and I'm sort of moving chronologically here, but I'll go back to Winston-Salem again in a second. So Clarence Poe, his residential segregation plan dies, but he finds another way to bring about residential segregation. He has this property. He owns hundreds of acres outside Raleigh. This was his farm. He called it Longview, with the title representing his progressive viewpoint, right, long view. So he developed it into Longview Gardens, and this is a typical house in Longview Gardens today, by the way, and it's a historic neighborhood. And so he attached these restrictive covenants to the deeds in Longview Gardens. So again, I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just give you a taste for the deed. It says, with the utmost respect and goodwill for all groups of people, but realizing that a high degree of homogeneity is necessary for that actively congenial community life desired for Longview Gardens, no land in Longview Gardens shall ever be sold, transferred, conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to, or occupied, servants accepted, by any person who is not wholly Caucasian. And then he lists, the backgrounds of the people he wants: English, Scotch, Welsh, Irish, etc. So restrictive covenants, are one method of segregating neighborhoods, although the Supreme Court declares them unenforceable in 1948. Then, of course, there's what David was talking about earlier, right? The redlining, right? So this is done by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So a federal agency started during the New Deal that assesses credit risk in particular neighborhoods. So here you see, again, the A1 neighborhoods are described as enjoying all city conveniences, uniform construction, but they're 100% white, right? Then B2, these are also white neighborhoods, but they're not as elegant, they're not as gracious as the A neighborhoods. Then C and D neighborhoods, C will have some African Americans. So in C5, African Americans are 3% of the neighborhood, and this neighborhood has other issues. It's suffering from smoke from factories, old properties, etc. But the D properties, these are majority African Americans, and it mentions, and again, I'm sorry it's cut off here, but it mentions that even some of these African Americans have middle class jobs, but just the fact that they are African American is enough to make their neighborhoods a bad credit risk. So they're essentially not able to get loans. And so, the effect of this, of course, is that people in the A properties and B properties are desperately going to try to keep African Americans out of their neighborhoods, because if blacks enter their neighborhoods, then their credit risk is the whole neighborhood's credit assessment is going to be worse. So this will it will sort of reinforce. David was saying, these haven't changed much, but there's a reason they haven't changed, right? It sort of reinforces segregation in that, you want to sort of keep the current rating, right? And then one of the last things I'll show you here is, images of Winston-Salem and urban renewal as helping to bring about residential segregation, right? I mean, you've been talking about the highway here that splits the two sides of the city, and of course there's the raising of sort of the downtown, and this is part of the whole story. I'm sure you all know more about this than I do. So I'll just read a quote from the book. Even without the state and local laws that middling whites wanted, residential segregation moved forward. It came about as school committees decided to locate schools for black and white students in separate areas, as white communities chose to exclude black buyers with restrictive covenants, and through other methods. Until the federal government imposed this type of segregation through Hulk, however, residential segregation was local and haphazard. Right, you see, trying this, trying that, some of it works, some of it doesn't, but with redlining, it becomes more rigid. And then I just want to summarize a couple points here, right? So one is that residential segregation laws failed because you didn't have the support of elites behind them, right? So I think all classes of whites could benefit from the segregation of public accommodation, but with residential segregation, that's not the case, right? It affects the interests of elites and middling whites differently. So elites want to keep their workers nearby, right? Reynolds wants his workers at hand, whereas middle-class whites have a different interest, which is that they want to be protected from competition with blacks over property and over jobs. And then just the last point is one that I made earlier too, and that is that that segregation in the U.S. no doubt would be worse if these ordinances and amendments and things had gone forward, as in South Africa. So that is all that I have, and I'm happy to discuss this with you.
So I'm going to try to stay out of the way, but just you keep the microphone up. David's going to come back up here too, and I'm sure there are some questions. Thank you for the great talk. I'm sure there are some questions in the audience, so I'll intervene if I need to, but otherwise I'll let you all call on folks and
I'm just curious as to how you came upon Winston-Salem as the heart of your book.
Well, I guess I'd started with Poe, so was focused first on the countryside, and then started realizing that Poe's actually in conversation with other segregationists who are doing the same thing in cities. And Winston-Salem is kind of the best place to look at this because you have that case of State v. Darnell. So, there are more records because of the case. So if you go to Raleigh, you can pull up the original case file and read all of these materials. Where say Greensboro, because that ordinance didn't go up to a case, it's just sort of reading newspaper articles. There just isn't as much information about it. In Mooresville, there's very little information at all. Any other questions?
So I just have a comment. I've done a lot of actually similar studies as you've done in this book, and I'm really excited to read it. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that it seems to me that East Winston becomes this contested space. And I think that you can see possibly a resistance to segregation in the private sphere that you don't see in the public sphere because they felt more empowered sort of in a protected residential space. And so in the same way that they've talked about the long civil rights movement and going back into Robert Corsad's book on civil rights unionism, I think you could take the civil rights movement in Winston-Salem and push it back to this contestation of space in East Winston, where African Americans are claiming a space as theirs, and they are getting pushback from white residents, but ultimately that is a failure. And there's this moment where East Winston becomes the heart of the Black community, and it's where the civil rights movement was launched. You know what I mean? So I feel like that there's just this moment where there's there's pushback, there's give and take, and the city then went to more drastic sort of scorched earth processes through the parks and the roads and everything. So anyway, I just wanted to say that I think that that is an important moment between 1917 and 1940. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents.
So I think I'll just say thank you for that. So yeah, I'm eager to listen to you all too, because I think you all have a lot of expertise being residents. I'm assuming you're all residents of Winston-Salem. So yeah, I won't need to comment on every comment, but just to say thanks.
I don't need to mic. I want to make my clarification on one of David's statements. where it said the city took Sarah's house. That was actually the state of North Carolina.
Oh, thank you.
That did that, so, yeah, that was not on us.
Thanks, Jeff, I appreciate that.
First, thank you for coming to speak with all of us. What do you think differentiates cities with higher eviction rates, such as Greensboro and Winston, from those with lower ones?
Can you repeat her question?
Sure, the question is, what differentiates cities with higher eviction rates like Greensboro and Winston-Salem from others? Do you want to take this one, David?
I am not an expert on evictions at this point, along the lines of doing a comparative analysis of what cities don't and which cities do. It's what I am finding in the little research that we've done over the past several months is that the issue of eviction is a crossroads for poverty, upward mobility, education, and financial literacy, access to property, resources, the economics of what's going on in the city today in terms of a livable wage. There's so many factors involved. And at the essence of it, in terms of affordable housing, the people I've spoken with typically point to just jobs that allow for a livable wage. And the fact that typically, you're paying 30% of your income on rent, 30 to 35, upward to 40 in some places. That seems reasonable. Forsyth County has been rated as high as 55%, according to what I've read in various sites. And it's not sustainable. And frankly, that combined with very little, if any, financial literacy at a time when you need it most, assessing how much you need to set aside for rent in a real way can lead to these evictions. So I'm guessing communities where the economy is more equitable, where the living wage is there, so people don't need to have 2 or 3 jobs to create enough income to pay for that 35% realm. Those communities are succeeding in that effort, and others are have a ways to go. That's my take.
So you mentioned, you described that obviously this situation is not unique to Winston-Salem. Like there's numerous cities and communities that had segregation and redlining, and even though the laws weren't passed or didn't persist, the segregation persists. In your research, are there communities that were able to, resolve that segregation? Are there model communities that we can look at to try and figure out, how to move forward with this?
Again, can you repeat her question?
The question is whether there are model communities that we can look at that have resolved residential segregation well. I don't know. Do you?
Oh, that's a tough question. I moved here from Austin, Texas, but I've lived in Detroit, I've lived in Chicago, I've lived in small towns in Wisconsin, and to various degrees. I think the scholarship that's being done at the Center for the Study of Economic Mobility and the Spatial Justice Lab, both through Winston-Salem State University, are doing great work on comparative analyses, because their goal is to look forward and how can we have productive ways of moving forward along those lines. I can tell you, while this is a very segregated city, for example, I've never met so many interesting people with such varied backgrounds in my life in any of the cities I've lived in, about a dozen of them. I can tell you I really loved the mix of people in Austin, Texas, in the various neighborhoods where I met hearing Spanish and English, and in certain parts of that city I sensed more of a balance. But that was a little oasis in Texas. Maybe some of you have examples of places you've lived that have seemed to achieve more of a racial balance or more of a less segregated balance, but I'm not aware of them. Chicago is a very segregated city, and that was definitely not a great example.
I would like to live in a much more diverse neighborhood than where I live now. Although I am noticing that while the schools in Winston-Salem are more segregated now than when we moved, there are very few that don't have any African American students. So some movement in that direction is happening. But one thing that troubles me is the whole issue of gentrification. That if you have a neighborhood, some of those neighborhoods in East Winston are lovely neighborhoods. If I were to move in, that could start the idea that, oh, now people are going to come, the property rates are going to go up, and will be moved on again. So I don't know how people handle the gentrification issue.
Gentrification is a really, really difficult topic, and Jeff McIntosh right there can tell you just as well as anybody, because he's very familiar with achieving that balance of how do you elevate the economic situation of a region, what's that silver bullet for doing that and seeing resurgence of businesses without driving out the very residents that live there when real estate values rise. Affordable housing is a huge issue in this city and in Greensboro and in High Point, everywhere you look. Without that at its core, it's very difficult to achieve that racial balance in an area. There needs to be a section of housing available within either the large high-rise that's being built or tract housing that is affordable. And by affordable, we don't mean $2,000 a month in rent. I don't believe it is the image of in moves a white couple and suddenly you're causing gentrification. I don't think that's accurate. And I at the same time, when these communities go through changes, it's a very complicated process and needs to be looked at from city managers, elected officials in a way that's equitable and a way that involves the community in dialogue early on and continually with respect to I think bridge that gap and make it a positive.
Question over here. I want to make sure we get this.
Thank you. David, you just mentioned equity and going through city councils, and my question was based on that. When y'all were talking about 52 and dividing Winston-Salem African Americans from downtown, and then Durham has 147 that does the exact same thing, and Greensboro has 29, that's kind of a similar thing. When you have these permanent infrastructures that are in place that kind of permanently segregate a community, what type of equitable things should we be seeking from our elected officials to bridge those permanent things that can't be undone?
These are such good questions, and that's one thing I love about living in Winston-Salem. Oftentimes the questions are just so thoughtful, and I feel like the one thing that spoke to that I revealed in a series we did on the Business 40 Reconstruction Project, which was interesting for me personally, was the designer they brought in from Oakland, whose name is escaping me, and I'm sure with names. Pardon? Walter Hood. Walter Hood. A genius in my mind, very, very thoughtful, and the work he did in Oakland, transforming the overpasses there to an underpass and a walkway and opening it up, this huge piece of infrastructure into a market in which people met. And I know it sounds idealistic, but that his goal for setting up the new Stowaway over Liberty, I believe, is to have enough wide space where people can have dialogues about bridging these neighborhoods. And the way he said it was very, very powerful to me. And I see that as a model, one of the few that just seems feasible, for example, for this city. And I think elected officials are having these conversations, and I'm very encouraged by a focus I'm seeing on the alleviation of poverty, reallocation, with CSEM, and I mentioned that the Spatial Justice Lab at CDI, and so many others. The new for prosperity, the Partnership for Prosperity that's been formed. All these people they're having these conversations every week, every day, and hopefully addressing those sorts of infrastructure issues. Infrastructure is, when it's there in place, it's very difficult you have to come up with some very creative solutions. That's it.
I'm gonna hijack the mic to ask a question, and then I know there's a question back there, and Jeff too, or no? We'll get two back there. This is a question for Elizabeth. Simple-minded folks like me might hear in the story you tell a simple takeaway, which is this class and economic interest trumps race in matters of racial segregation. I doubt that the story is that simple, nor do I think you probably want me to take that away. Can you debunk that view? Because some might take strange comfort in a story that says it's class, not race, that explains the trouble that still kind of lives in this town.
So if I understand that correctly, the idea is that elites are not racist, because I'm saying very much that they are, but that they were in the story that I'm telling, but that their vision of white supremacy is just different, right? That someone like R.J. Reynolds, he's a white supremacist too, right? But he just wants to keep his workers nearby so that he can have the workers at hand who are the cheapest workers out there, right? Which is black workers. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, I mean, I just that the interest. I mean, the really interesting part of your story to me is the way that whites saw it differently from depending on their class status, and that the difference is explained, as I understood it, by their different class status. So race didn't seem as dominant in the story you told, although I think you probably, maybe that's the foundation of it all, and then there's a difference in class status.
Right.
That answers my question. Let me run.
Hi, I'm a student at Wake Forest Law School, and I did my undergrad in community development at Asheville, and so I could ask questions all day, but I guess my main question is, where do we go from here? And we see the stories currently happening with infrastructure coming in and affecting lives right now. And in studying law, I've seen that a lot of voice and community capital prevents these things from happening. So there's pushback. Which I really appreciated the comment about pushing back against the infrastructure, and so my main question now is just where do we go from here? Like, what programs can we get involved in? There are programs that are developing. I know that I just looked them up so that I would be able to say them as I said this comment. But Goler Community Development Program. The Project for Renewal, I think, is championing for children, especially seeing as we are a very at-risk area. So I guess, just in the spirit of making sure that this doesn't just go to waste, there's plenty of people here, like, where can we take this interest and this passion to see these problems erased? Where can we go to, move forward?
Well, the microphone is back there. Can you hand it back, and maybe we'll piggyback two questions together, and then bring the mic back up here.
Wow. Okay. I was born and raised in Miami, pretty segregated, and I also had the chance to work and live in New York for a couple of months. And in 2017, the Right to Counsel NYC Coalition campaigned and eventually won an initiative for the right to counsel when facing an eviction, and I was wondering if any of you had any thoughts about the effectiveness of that on racial segregation in neighborhoods and eviction rates, and if other initiatives are happening in other cities.
So I'll just apologize. I can't really field some of these questions, so my expertise is more in the past. And I guess what I can bring to the table, I guess, is a sense that is to help people understand that, you know, the segregation that we see today didn't just spring up, right? That there were historical processes that created it, and I think we should understand those to, you know, to fully understand the picture of how we got there. But as for how to fix it, I'm not really your person, but I suspect there are people here who do have more expertise in this. So
Can I offer one comment?
Yeah,
that can be
please.
done? I think one of the reasons that
our eviction rate is so high is that in North Carolina, if your landlord, if you miss a payment and your landlord sort of defensively puts in an eviction notice, and then you pay your rent, the notice stays on your record. Okay, so that hurts your credit, you know, from now till eternity. That's a legislative change that I think can be easily made. Our legislative group can be easily contacted. You know, Paul Lowe, Durham Montgomery, Evelyn Terry will be proud sponsors of that, I think, but I just don't know that it's come up. And to me, it seems like something where a little lobbying can go a long way.
Is that a municipal level, Jeff, or is it state?
And I could add to that just one little thing. There are groups in town as well. I think of Housing Justice Now that is very busy trying to alert people to renters' rights throughout East Winston, Cleveland Homes, Yvonne Circle, banging on doors and doing good work. And I think that they're, this again, financial literacy, renters' rights, those sorts of things do contribute to less eviction certainly, and at least the awareness that your landlord can't retaliate against you simply because you brought in the city to inspect because you had roaches in your refrigerator and the landlord didn't fix it. Those sorts of rights are being more broadly spread, I think, and that's one group that's working on that.
I work with a lot of groups in the city, doing a lot of activism. Right now I've been working with schools and Action for Equity, Coalition for Equity in Public Education. I think a lot of this begins in the schools and what we're teaching our children. You know, they've been affected by all of this segregation. And frankly, they don't know who they are because African American history is not mandatory in our schools. So they, you know, white children don't know African American history, black children don't know African American history, and other cultures as well. It's not mandatory. So a lot of us are working on trying to get that as mandatory. I went to a wonderful River Run movie last night. The Carolina Chocolate Drops. I don't know if anybody saw that in here. Yeah, wasn't that awesome? And I think that something like that should be in every school. It's about, you know, 3 African Americans that resurrected the tradition of string band. And they didn't know, these were highly trained musicians. They did not know that the banjo was from Africa originally. You know, I mean, these are guys in their 30s right now. It's astounding to me. We have not taught our children well. Everything begins with that. So I encourage people to get involved in what's going on at the schools right now.
So I hate to do this because I know there are still hands in the room, but we are running out of time because Bookmarks closes at 9, and there needs to be some de-setting up in here. I'm gonna give the mic to Michelle McCullough for the last word before I guess I say one last word.
So I'm a history person too, so I'm gonna take it back to you. What I'd like to say is thank you very much for your study and for what you're doing here, because what I think, I agree with the education, but what I learned, and I got this book about a week ago. I came in the first day I've been asking, and I've read The Color of Law, which gives a national perspective of the issues that you're talking about here. I think there's even more to discuss. There's even more research to be done. But I want to thank you for what you've done, because I was born in Pennsylvania. I'm a northerner, Yankee here. Okay, so but I didn't realize any of this went on, and I never learned it, and I have a lot of African American friends since I moved here, and a lot of them didn't know. We didn't know what had gone on. So now we're all standing here going, how do we fix everything? What's the problem? And I think you're right. We have to know this story first, because you have to know how things were set up, because the pictures you were showing, they're still that way. And so we've got to do a better job of communicating that if I want to move in your neighborhood, I'm not here to make it worse. I'm here for us to live. So I just wanted to thank you very much. I hope everyone gets a chance to buy it, see it, read it. Mike wants to.
That's a great segue, actually. I was going to say something similar to close and actually to invoke the Color of Law book by Richard Rothstein, right? And I think this book. Thank you both for being here, and David for the gift that you keep giving the city with your research and storytelling about these issues in a contemporary setting, and Elizabeth Herbin-Triant for this book, which is a gift to the city, and in fact fills a hole that Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, is an incredible book, and I paged through it and I was like, oh, I wish there was more Winston-Salem in here, and other than the Darnell case, there's a reference to that, but Winston really isn't featured, and so now the two books together, I think, would be a great paired read. So thank you for the gift you've given this city now for years to come, so that we can read and learn about this important story, and that it'll inform these, as you can tell, a really charged, lively urban community now trying to reckon with the problems at hand, but as you say, to look into the history of it is a good starting point for those conversations. So thank you both. Thank you so much for all of you being here. There are, if you have books, I know Elizabeth will be willing to sign, and we'll get set up somewhere over in that direction. I'm sure Bookmarks would be happy to sell you volumes of books before they close at 9, so stay and shop and chat. And again, thanks to our guests, and thank you to all of you for being here. Good night.
Go. You need the right group.